So, welcome, you guys. I'm curious, and this would, and I mean this, I'd really love it if a couple of people rose their hands. We can't hear from everybody, but I do mean it when I say I'd like to know. Anyone willing to share what they're interested in learning tonight? Like, what brought you here? Anyone? Yeah, please.
Well, I'm studying literature and women, and I actually took the class about 2 semesters ago that talked about Victorian literature, and this was one of the questions that came up.
The woman question?
Yeah.
So, women in literature. That's fantastic.
We really talked about the angel in the house.
Yeah. I'm actually going to be reading a little bit from Virginia Woolf later.
We talked about room of her own.
Yeah, that's when we're reading. Awesome. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah. So, what's your name? So Ashley, did you notice she said women and literature, right? That kind of sets up the theme for the talk. Anyone else want to share what they're interested in, what brought them here? The wine? No, you had no other plans? Yeah.
My advisor in grad school was Nancy Henley, who wrote the book Body Politics
Yeah.
in the 70s.
Yeah.
And this is the second time I've been in New York City in 3 decades.
Oh, cool. Welcome.
And yesterday was the first time I've been here.
Oh, awesome. Well, I hope I can deliver then. That raises the stakes. Okay. Yeah. Hi, thank you for telling me that. Hi. Yeah, please, one more.
I'm interested in unpacking my personal limiting beliefs about being a woman.
Okay, but what it means to be a woman. What is a woman?
To be a woman and my place in the world.
Okay, wonderful place to start. These are really great. Thank you, guys. Okay, now we're ready to dive in. This is exactly, tell me, what's your name? Aubrey. So Aubrey, your question that you posed is kind of where I'm thinking of this talk tonight. We described it kind of in 2 ways. The woman question, which was an actual question that was posed in the 19th century. Before that too, but the 19th century is when it reached its kind of like epic peak. But also, what I actually kind of want us to think about the question of what is a woman? These 2 questions kind of intermixing with each other. So a little bit about myself that'll help us kind of set up what we're doing. So I'm a historian. I study, my research is on slavery. I'm also very interested in gender and sexuality, so I'm often described as a historian of women, and I teach a class at CUNY, BMCC CUNY, called The History of Women is the actual title of the class. The History of Women. Like, all women, every continent, every century, right? It's like, can you imagine a class called The History of Men? I mean, right. So this positioning of other, of being sort of relegated to the status of not history, right? Women's history. What is it that? So I teach American history, but I also teach women's history. And every semester, I'm tempted to just teach the women's history syllabus in both courses because they're both American survey courses. And I would love to just teach the women's history course in my regular history class and see if anybody objected, right? Okay, so what is the woman question? If you're unfamiliar with this, has anyone never heard this term before, the woman question? Is it new to some folks? Okay, great, so let me tell you a little bit about it. And we'll start by looking at some images that I've collected from the 19th century. Oh shit, sorry. Okay, so I don't know if you guys can see all this, but these are, I just did like a really quick Google image search to come up with this stuff. You can find countless more examples of this. But basically, in the 19th century, somewhat in the 18th century too, but there was just an explosion, like a discursive explosion of thought about the nature of women. What are women's mental capacities? Are women good at, should women really mother? What is their role in mothering? Should women vote? Well, if women should vote, if women should mother but not vote, what are we going to do about the fact that they're fucking raising voters? Maybe we should teach them something about politics, right? This sort of what do we do about women? I mean, it really was can you guys see some of this? On the woman question, women's thoughts on women. Samantha, on the woman question. So the question then becomes, I guess, what is your question?
I'm just struck by how similar this is to the Jewish question.
Yes, so you said the Jewish question. It also reminds me very much of W.E.B. Du Bois in his response to the Negro problem, right? So Simone de Beauvoir talks about what it's like to be a question. W.E.B. Du Bois talks about what it's like to be a problem. He said, you should not be asking me what it's like to be black. You should ask me what it's like to be a problem for you to solve, right? Okay, so the question for me as a historian then is why then. Like, it's not like all of a sudden all these men are like, holy shit, there's women. What are they doing, right? Like, why in the 19th century did this begin in the West? And I also want to it's very important, and I will make this mistake, and I try to steer away from it, but I do still make the mistake. Take note, these folks that are asking questions about women. I know there's only a couple of images here, but implicitly, what women are being questioned or pondered? White, middle-class women. So woman, we need to remember, the woman question was never about women. It was about this category politically designated woman. Simone de Beauvoir in The Second Sex, she shifts very mindfully between saying a woman and woman. She said, I'm writing a book about woman, right? Not a woman, woman. And she knows that's a political category that's been invented, more or less, in the late 18th century. And it's a white middle-class category. So I'll be thinking a lot about race tonight too, but I just want us to keep that at the forefront of our mind. The women question, nobody was asking about the role of black women in public life in the 19th century. Okay. So, but the question, and when I've looked through a lot of this literature, and people studied the woman's bodies, women's mental capacities, their emotional capacities, their capacities to mother, et cetera, what really they were asking is, what are women good for? And I actually did find, and this was in some editorial sort of comments back to, to magazine editors, but one man did write, what are women good for? I think we should just stop for a second and just say that in your mind to yourself. And if you are or not a woman, or if you identify a woman, just imagine living in a time when the question was really posed, yeah, but what are you good for? Okay. Okay, so I've mentioned this already. This is a discursive explosion here. Oops. Hello? Okay. I don't know if the image here, you guys probably can't quite make this out, but this young woman here this is like a political protest image. She's holding a poster board that just has a question mark on it. So I found this image where the woman question was posed enough so that young women resisted this sort of this artistic demonstration. So the author that best captures, I think, the nature of the woman question and what it was like to live through the 19th century when learned experts were discussing the merits and the capacities and the value and the purpose, really, the purpose. What is the purpose of woman? Why does she exist, right? What's she good for? The person who I think best captures this, as Ashley was mentioning, Virginia Woolf. Have you guys read A Room of One's Own? Just drop everything you're doing this weekend and read A Room of One's Own, right? So I'm going to actually, it's going to be tough because of my voice, but I'm going to read an excerpt from this, just about a paragraph. So I'll set this up for you. Virginia Woolf was invited to a college to give a lecture on the role of women in literature. And she's a established writer at this point. She's Virginia Woolf, right? And she writes this very sarcastic, very insightful, amazing essay about what women need in order to write. And the answer is they need a room of their own. But before she does this, she kind of makes fun of the invitation by saying, what does it mean to be a woman and a writer? A man would never be asked, hey, we'd like you to give a talk on being a man and a writer, right? They'd say about being anything else in a writer, but never being, so what's it like to be a male athlete, right? Okay, so this is Virginia Woolf, and she's talking about, before she gave her presentation, she was going to go to the library and really try to understand the nature of women. So she went up to the card catalog, and she pulled out the index, and she said, I'm going to read everything that's been written on women. And this is where she's telling the readers what she found. One went to the counter, one took a slip of paper, one opened a volume of the catalog, and the 5 dots here indicate 5 separate minutes of stupefaction, wonder, and bewilderment. Have you any notion how many books are written about women in the course of 1 year? Have you any notion how many are written by men? Are you aware that you are perhaps the most discussed animal in the universe? Even the names of the books gave me food for thought. Sex and its nature might well attract doctors and biologists, but what was surprising and difficult of explanation was the fact that sex, woman, that is to say, also attracts agreeable essayists, light-fingered novelists, young men who have taken the MA, men who have no degree, men who have no apparent qualifications save that they are not women. It was the most strange phenomenon, and apparently, here I consulted the letter M, one confined to the male sex. Women do not write books about men, a fact that I could not help but welcome with relief. What could be the reason, then, of this curious disparity, I wondered, jarring cartwheels on the slips of paper provided by the British taxpayer for other purposes? Why are women judging from this catalog so much more interesting to men than men are to women? So that, right, she's talking about, as these men are debating the nature of women and women's capacities, what she's done here was so brilliant is she's invoked what we talk about in feminist theory. So I'm having a bit of trouble with this clicker. Is what it means to pose a question and to position something as an object of study. Does that make sense, right? As soon as you're studying women, right? So let's say even today, like you're a sociologist, historian, right? So I'm a historian of women, right? Immediately, let's use historian of women since I'm a historian. I study slavery. If I tell you I'm a slavery historian, I study women. What's your first question? Which women, right? I'm studying slavery. Am I going to study the black and white women's relationship as the same to the experience of slavery, right? And I've also, in deciding to study women in the past, I've automatically assumed that their experience of being a woman is the primary experience of their political life. So if I'm interested in studying enslaved women, for example, as a historian, I have made enslaved women an object of study, and I'm the question asker, right? So I'm a subject, and I get to ask a question about the past. And by saying I'm going to study them as women, I've predetermined that that's what shaped their lives more than anything else. Are you with me? If I could get in a time machine and go back to the past and talk to enslaved women and ask them, what's the number one political bummer of your life? Is it being a woman or being a slave? Do you see what I'm saying? They'd be like, fuck you, right? The woman, being a woman definitely shaped enslaved women's lives. They had different experiences of slavery than men did. But do you understand that it overestimates or over-implies sort of a political subject category from the outset, and it objectifies the experience of womanhood, right? And so Virginia Woolf is calling this into question. So what I see her doing in this is she's pointing out the fact that even if a woman takes on the woman question, and you might have noticed on that first slide with those images, some of the authors were actually women. Women joined in this debate. I think, what's her name, Lydia Marie Child, she joined, women can read, people joined in the debate, right? But the point is, even if it was women joining the debate, the subject, the question is inherently a masculine one. And because the object is the feminine. Does that make sense? So even if a woman joins the debate and tries to stand up for the merits of women, she's doing so as a masculine inquirer. That subject-object relationship, we talk about this a lot with my students in my women's studies class. To position yourself as someone who needs to know an other is to position yourself in relationship to power. The woman question, the reason I argue that it's an inherently masculine question, that and no matter who's asking it, it's a male question, it's because the question is a relationship of power. So this is when I brought up W.E. Du Bois later. He was a black sociologist at the end of the 19th century, into the early 20th century, and he studied black life in America. But he was often critical of this fact that race positioned, that he had to study, quote, the Negro. Right, that he understood that he was automatically kind of playing into this institutional relationship that positioned some people as things to be studied. One way, if you can't get the concept of that as an inherently power relationship, just imagine if the things at the bottom of the microscope just turned back and looked at you and shot you or something. Do you know what I mean? We have power over things that we study. They don't have power over us. So the studying of women, for whatever the benevolency of it or the political agenda of it is a power relationship. So the reason I started here is, though we are going to be talking primarily about suffrage, I wanted you guys to understand that the suffrage debate was situated in a much larger sort of century and a half long debate about the nature of women. So I'm talking, it's good, my voice is working. I'm trying to think out how to make this segue. So you think tonight's about the women in the vote, which it is. But it's also about the nature of what are folks, when they're really, think about the 19th century, they're debating, should women have the right to vote, right? So what they're really debating is, what is a woman? Like, what is it about the woman's whatever, right? I don't even want to like give it away by saying body. What is it about woman and voting that seems somehow incongruent with one another? So to get started, I do just want to pause and ask. Raise your hand if you guys do think women exist. Okay, cool. Does anyone want to, and in the interest of time, like a couple sentences, want to tell me what it is, a woman? Like if you raise your hand, somebody's got to say what it is. What's that?
Beauty.
What?
It's beauty.
Women is beauty? Okay. What's that? Womb? Okay, so if I have a hysterectomy? If I'm trans? Yeah.
Well, it's a trans. I was going to say a person with 2 X chromosomes.
So the body? Yeah.
It's almost just the perception of how being born in our society versus one thing.
So a woman is somehow only available to you when you are treated as woman. Yeah, right? All these are possible. Beauty, XX. I always forget if it's XX or XY. I always have to ask my students, right? I was joking around with David and Chris, but it actually wasn't a joke. I just Googled women's suffrage. Like sometimes I'm like, wait, when did it happen? Like anyway, the basic facts sometimes get lost in historians. So it's like XX, okay. Okay, so yes, the reason I did ask the question is I was kind of trying to goad you guys into bringing up the body. And the reason I wanted to do this is if you think somehow that the body has always been the first and foremost place that social commentators or philosophers or religious thinkers or political leaders have turned to define woman, you might be surprised. So let's look at some anatomy textbook pictures and get a sense of the past. Okay, so the body, like every other thing that's around us, has a history. It changes in relationship to the society that surrounds it. It changes in relationship to knowledge. So we're going to look at some anatomy textbook drawings of genitals, just so you know. These are going to be genitals. And these are from, these are pre-modern. So I believe these are from the 16th century. And I'm taking this, just to do my citation, I'm taking this from the work of the historian Thomas LaCour, who wrote the book Making Sex. So what are we looking at here? Someone say it. Right? Looks like a penis, doesn't it? Would you be surprised if I told you this is an anatomical drawing of a vagina from an early medical textbook? And so is this. Also a vagina. So interesting, right? Yeah, take a picture of me. Hold on. So, all right, now this is where I need to really invite you guys to, try this idea on. If you're looking at this and you're thinking to yourself, man, they were so stupid in the past, you've basically just committed the same error of calling another culture stupid because they're not like yours, right? The past isn't dumber, and we're not getting smarter, and progress is a lie. I'm sorry, right? So what's amazing to me about, I showed these to a friend of mine he's incredibly intelligent, and he was like, no, but that's not what they look like. I was like, but have you ever seen a vagina, like a human cut in half, like vivisected? I was like, I've actually never seen. And he's like, yeah, I've seen one. I was like, you have? He's like, well, the drawings of one. And he still thought the drawings today must be accurate, and those must be inaccurate. Does that make sense? Like he just couldn't conceive of the fact that maybe we see the world reflected through our own cultural beliefs. So if this is an anatomy textbook taught to doctors in the pre-modern era, we have to assume that this was a pretty good drawer. The artist was probably pretty good at what he or she did. I don't know if it's a male or female artist. This is what they saw. It does look a lot to us like a penis, doesn't it? Okay, so this is what Thomas LaCour argues, the historian of the body. This is called the one-sex model of the body. And for a long time in Western thought, the body was thought, like 16th, 17th century, if you read medical textbooks, they describe the body as sort of one body. Even Aristotle, if you go back that far, has some notion that the body is somehow one, and that women are just really half-cooked men. Like, so basically the idea was, even so in the 17th, 18th century, what you see in a lot of medical textbooks is that the body was inherently male, and that women were just not fully formed men. And so if you cooked long enough, if you got hot enough, literally, so that what we think of as gender was understood in terms of degrees. Like men were hotter and women were colder. So if you got hot enough, your genitals popped out, like a turkey, you know what I mean? Like, but if you didn't get hot enough, they stayed inside. It's not entirely crazy, is it? I mean, I do history of medicine, and I love thinking about, like, we're all gonna be wrong someday. Like, it's like his science keeps proving itself to, like, it keeps making mistakes. You think we're at the point, like, whew, good thing that's over. Good thing science is right now, right? So, but it's not that insane, right? Like testicles, what is it? Sperm, like they die if they get too hot, right? Other evidence we have that people thought of the body as sort of a one-sex model as opposed to the two-sex model. Bloodletting, if you get sick. Men, and in some places in European culture, men would let blood monthly because they believed that was one thing that they lost when they became full men, was the ability to let blood, and that kept them healthy and colder. So if you had a fever, you let blood, because women seem to stay healthier because they let blood monthly. And so the question then does become, like, what if it's a one-sex model, where do babies come from? And this, I have like nothing political to say about this, but I just love this picture so much, so I had to include it. Can you guys see that? It's a sperm, and they believed that the entire baby, there's like a little baby tucked in the sperm. And so it makes sense, right? If the body is inherently male, the body comes from the male's body, right? And so the entire human, and the woman's just a cooker, which is nice because she's not too hot. So she won't cook the baby too fast. So I say this to, now, just to point out that it sounds very sexist to us, doesn't it? Is there a possibility for interpreting this in a less than super sexist way? Yeah, please, what are you thinking? Well, you nodded, like put you on the spot, so you don't have to answer, but.
Well, the actual biological development, presumably they encountered lots of children who were in the process of developing in the womb.
And intersex individuals, et cetera, yeah.
And the womb, at least, like the progression is everyone starts off female and then sex differentiates.
Right. So there is maybe some actual like truth behind this. Yeah, what's another way, and also I'm thinking politically to read this optimistically. If women and men are both kind of men, it sounds really sexist. It is, but I just want to offer one other interpretation. They're also not that different from each other. Does that make sense? There's no such thing as opposite sexes in this paradigm. Men and women are not opposites. They're more alike than they are different. Right? So that's what's really important for us. So by the 19th century, in the West, after you have the rise of, like, there's the three big ones. If you've been to any of my oleos, or if you've taken my class, I was like, I'm looking at you. What are the three major historic changes in the West that we say kind of like the three big ones, starting in the 18th century into the 19th century? Just guess if you don't know. Industrialization, capitalism, right? What's that? Well, yeah, so capitalism, like the sort of the rise of the bourgeoisie. I'll just say, I just forgot for a second. Oh yeah, the Enlightenment, right? So the Enlightenment philosophy that emerged in the 18th century, and the democratic revolutions. So the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Haitian Revolution. So the rise of democracy, capitalism, and the rational philosophy, science, et cetera. These are the major changes that shift in the 19th century. So the question for us then becomes, what do these major changes do that produce a society that comes to think of men and women as opposites? Not as different, not as existing on some scale in relationship to each other, not as hot or cold, but as literally two different animals, two different, almost species. I didn't include it tonight just because I knew I'd be pressed for time, and now I'm going to use the time and tell you about it. What's really interesting too is the same, like the 19th century, they were writing about like what is a woman. These same doctors are writing about what is an African, or what is a Jewish person, what is an Irishman, right? And what's interesting is if you look at their taxonomies or whatever, like they're sort of the way they grouped people together. One of the things I found most interesting is they would say, the Negro is like a woman. And it's like, these are overlapping categories, right? And you're inherently assuming that the Negro is the man and the woman is white. Do you see, like the way their thinking is operating here? So I've given you like the major historic material shifts in the world. What else is happening in the 19th century? Slavery, the rise of empire, right? Massive class distinctions. You know, I mean, like race as a theory is being articulated scientifically. And women and their bodies are being, for the first time, defined as biologically inferior to men. So when we all said bodies, XX, I'm not criticizing you. That would have been really weird in the 18th century. People in the 18th century probably would have said, well, the difference is women have a different relationship to God. Or women have a different relationship to families. They wouldn't have talked about the bodies. They would have, and so all of us going straight to genitals, like we're either a bunch of perverts or we just live in a different time, right? So by the 19th century, the one-sex model has been replaced, oops, let's go back. Oop, hi guy, okay. By the two-sex model. And what's interesting to me is this idea, so now men and women are considered opposites. And what do you notice? They're so opposite that we've got to take whale bones and crush women's bodies so they look extra opposite. Like there's like a little bit of a difference between a woman's waist and a man's waist. So we take a corset, strap it on her till her ribs break and she can't breathe, right? So to make sure that we all realize, yes, she does have boobs and a butt. She's very different, right? I mean, and then that difference, seeing that sort of the woman's exaggerated different body comes to appear as natural. I talk to my students about this all the time. They're always talking about the differences between men and women's bodies. But if we all just stopped doing anything, like just stopped showering, stopped grooming, we would look really similar really fast, right? We have like a little less body hair, so then we wax it all off and say that it's natural to be hairless, right? Okay, so let's get then to positioning this then in the rise of the women's suffrage movement. Okay, so how am I doing for time? Okay, good. Sorry, guys. So the vote. In the context of this broader question about what is a woman, what is she good for, is a woman a body? I hope I've made it clear. By the 19th century, there was an understanding the woman was a body. The woman was defined by her womb. I wish I could share there's so many good examples. There's this one guy, doctor I was reading, and he was like, obviously, women should not be taught to read and write, because when they're on their period, their blood's gonna go to their head, it's gonna screw up their menstrual cycle. Thank you. Do you see like the theories? Another one that I love. This is really good. Women naturally should not be secretaries because secretaries' positions. It was the first kind of managerial class of the Industrial Revolution, so it was a man's job. They should not be secretaries because if God had wanted them, or if nature had wanted them to be secretaries, they would have made their hands bigger for the typewriters, because typewriters come from trees, right? Like they're like. And these are like, anyway, I know I'm not trying to make fun of the past. I mean, we do the same thing today. Like, the way science is used to perpetuate gender inequality, and like unflinchingly. I mean, who's the woman recently? She won some sort of major Olympic sport, and they made her body get tested for chromosomal like we still think this way. Can you imagine? Like, can we all just? What does anyone know her name? I should have. Yeah, think about this. We made her subject her body to medical violence. Right? Fuck that. Sorry. Okay, so the vote. Why then? So I say why now then, because I want us to kind of think of ourselves as being members of the past as we do this. So this is gonna be where I really have to do my thing and speed up. I'm gonna do 100 years of discussions about democracy in 5 minutes, but don't worry, I can do this. So it starts with the American Revolution, right? Okay, so a lot of you guys probably know a lot about the American Revolution. You probably know a lot of lies. That's not your fault. Most of what you're taught about the American Revolution in this country is complete and utter bullshit. It was not about taxation. The taxes were actually lowered by the British. It was a bunch of smugglers in New England who just did not want to pay, white rich men who didn't want to pay their fair share of taxes, but they still wanted all the benefits of taxation, like the military and protection and things like this. Anyway, so that's the American Revolution, right? It's awful. And in this, what's interesting is, so John Adams, not John Locke, so John Adams, in the revolutionary rhetoric though, these were, as flawed and as bigoted people as they were very well, they were thinkers, right? Like they read John Locke and all this stuff. And John Adams, there's this great exchange between he and one of his friends where he's like, dude, listen, like, look at our philosophy. Based on what we are arguing, women will get the right to vote. Like, we are fucked. Like, women will get the right to vote if we argue for democracy, because virtual representation is inherently flawed. The idea that the British Empire should not be able to vote for its colonies because they didn't have anyone here. Do you guys know this idea? And they're like, we get to have a vote because you can't understand what it's like to be us. We're Americans, you're far away. So virtual representation was the idea they were challenging. They're like, we should have direct representation because we're different from you and you can't speak for us. And John Adams was like, hey, who's different from us? Women, based on what we're arguing. And his wife, Abigail, is writing letters like, yeah, honey, did you notice that, right? Like, Abigail's awesome, right? And she was, she like stopped hanging out with Thomas Jefferson because he had slaves. Like, she was great. So essentially what they did in the other thing that happens in the American Revolution, this is philosophically a subtle point. It's hard to make it very quickly, but I'm just going to say it and just believe me. Dependence became degraded. A revolution framed around independence from the empire or from the motherland inherently degraded the idea that we are interdependent. And being independent and like a subject sovereign to yourself was suddenly the celebrated citizen. Under the British Empire, everybody was subject to the king. Even the men were beneath somebody. Nobody was the king but the king. So everybody understood that they were beneath somebody. And what the American Revolution did is it really just kind of made all white men kings in their own minds. It raised a level of inequality between men and women because it degraded interdependence. And does that make sense? It celebrated rhetorically this language of being independent and not needing other things. So this is the beginning of this debate. It crystallizes. Shoot. Am I doing something? Okay. The women's rights movement begins in the 1820s. It begins as women start to join reform movements trying to end slavery. Black and white women are working together in the North and the South. And as they work, and this is an important part historically, because we're gonna end on a darker note here, but remember, women's rights movement originated from American abolitionism. The first women's rights movement came when women were working together with black and white men, black and white women working together to end slavery. And when women were barred from speaking publicly against slavery, they started to understand they needed to fight for their rights as women too. That they would not have any political impact in ending something like human bondage if they didn't have access to this. And doing this in the 19th century as a woman was considered obscene if men were in the room. And women were often attacked. Sojourner Truth was attacked and stripped naked several times when she tried to address audiences about slavery. To prove that she was really a man. She wasn't, she was a woman. But it was a very, very hostile environment for women to speak publicly. The Jacksonian era, does anyone need any questions or anything? I know I'm moving fast, but I just want to cover it. Okay. The Jacksonian era, so this is, okay, can we just pause for a minute and remember when, what did 45 say? Oh yeah, Andrew Jackson could have stopped the war. Like when he died, like 15 years before it or something, and made sure his favorite slave was buried right next to him because he's super creepy like that. So if you go to his grave, there's like he made his slaves be his slaves in death. I mean, he's just awful. Okay, so Jacksonian democracy, though, what this is a moment in time. And I have to go into Jedi mode to explain this clearly and quickly. With the rise of market capitalism, right? Markets are invented. People start working for wages instead of working for barter and trade and working for agriculturally on home-based farms, home-based economies. Gradually over the 19th century, more and more people have access to a wage market, but those people tend to be white men. So people can slowly start to survive on wages as opposed to working interdependently with other family members on a farm. Nobody is like a bachelor farmer. You're never gonna meet like a guy who runs a farm. A farm, like if you have to subsist on your own farm, you're gonna get married and you're gonna have a lot of kids because half of them are gonna die and the rest of them you hope are gonna make enough food to feed you into old age. So everybody needed each other under an agricultural economy. With the rise of market capitalism, suddenly some people have access to this thing called a wage, and now there's things being mass produced. And so what you see after the American Revolution is state by state, states start abolishing their land requirements for voting. So you no longer had to have land to vote. You just had to be a man. And this wasn't somehow like You know how sometimes like historical changes happen, they pass over people, but they don't seem to know they were happening, but we look back in the past and we're like, oh, that happened to you. This is not one of them. These folks knew very much, we are making wages. We may not own land, but we're no longer dependent on landlords. Think about that language. So there's things like Dora's War in Rhode Island, I think, or Delaware, one of those states, where these working class white men said, we don't own land, but we earn a wage, so we own ourselves. So we should have the right to vote. So self-ownership became the definition of like what required the independence needed to vote. Before this, you had to have land to vote, either in the British Empire or in the American Revolution. Even some states like Virginia didn't abolish land requirements well into the 19th century. So what does this mean then? The reason I bring this up is when we talk about the fact that women start demanding the right to vote. Anyone know when the first demand was for the right to vote for women in the United States? I just forgot. 1848, right? Okay, so it's 1848. And when I always tell my students it's really important when we study the past that we do not let ourselves get duped into talking like, oh, because like women started to get it. You know what I mean? Like they woke up to their own oppression, man. They got woke. Like, no. They didn't ask for the right to vote before because the right to vote was not considered a human right. If your husband can't vote, why would you ask for the right to vote? Poor people can't vote. You're poor, your husband's poor, you can't vote, he can't vote, your son can't vote, nobody can vote. When suddenly any poor white sap, no matter what he does with his life, can vote, but you, maybe you even own land because your father left you the property and you're a woman, can't vote, suddenly it's like, wait, where the hell is my vote? Does that make sense? Democracy became a woman's right when it became framed as somehow a universal human right, and that universal human was inherently masculine. So I'm just cautioning us to be very careful about thinking that somehow women have become aware suddenly of their oppression. They didn't need the vote. The vote wasn't how you participated in public life for most people, right? So this is the sort of context for women starting to ask for the right to vote. And then the next major historic shift in the 19th century that really sparked some of the darker parts of the women's suffrage movement. Anyone guess what it is? Passage of the 14th to 15th Amendments. Raise your hand, and I'm not doing this for any sinister reason. I'm doing this because as a historian, I'm very curious to know the public knowledge around this because I think it's important. Raise your hand if you just don't know what the 14th and 15th Amendments are. Okay, raise your hand if you know what the First Amendment is. Okay, raise your hand if you don't know. No, I'm just kidding. How would I do more? So the First Amendment, right? Right to, what is it, speech, blah, 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 blah. Okay. What most people don't understand is that the first 10 amendments, what we call the Bill of Rights, they didn't mean shit until the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment shifted like the rights of citizens to the federal government and away from state governments. So if you read the Constitution, what it says is, First Amendment, Congress shall pass no, states shall pass no act, something, wait, hold on. Yeah, Congress, yeah.
Establishment,
Yeah.
religion, or free exercise thereof, or
She's a political scientist.
something, right, speech, press, right to assemble and petition.
But it's
government.
Congress, right? They say Congress.
Specifically Congress.
Yeah, Congress shall pass no acts abridging blah, 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 right? But what does that mean about South Carolina or Indiana? Try giving abolitionist speech in South Carolina. South Carolina could limit free speech. Congress couldn't limit free speech. States had rights to limit people's rights, and they did all the time. That's why you had slavery, right? The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment was passed to ensure that freed black people would be treated as citizens, and there wouldn't be some idea like, oh, they're outsiders. So it says due process. Anyone born in the United States is a citizen, regardless of race or ethnicity. But it also shifts their citizenship to the federal government, saying states can pass no laws that abridge it centralizes our rights. 15th Amendment, all men the right to vote. Okay, so here's do you guys get mad? Is it bother you if I cuss? The 14th Amendment is the first fucking time the word male entered the Constitution. And they said, but not women. The most radically minded political leaders in the country who were making sure to protect black freedom after the Civil War were like, wait, but not women. It had never been put in the Constitution before. So in some states, women could vote if they owned enough property before the Civil War. It was sporadic, it was kind of local, it was weird, there wasn't a centralized state yet. But what a lot of folks understand, the reason there was such a huge divide between the women's rights movement and the civil rights movement in the late 19th century is because suddenly this group that had been working together, people trying to end human bondage and people trying to work for women's liberation, they were suddenly divided by this law. Does that make sense? This law that was meant to protect people regardless of race, for the first time enshrined into the Constitution that women don't have rights. And what Elizabeth Cady Stanton said when she was like talking with Frederick Douglass and like, you know, they're like, she worked effortlessly to petition for the 13th Amendment. With the 14th Amendment, she was begging Douglass and other black leaders to withdraw their support from Congress, because they're like, if you pass this, you will set us back 100 years. It's never been enshrined in the Constitution that women can't vote. They weren't being anti-black, but they're saying like, now we have to like get it out of the Constitution, and it's not there yet. Does that make sense? So what follows then is a really ugly history where suddenly groups that had worked together and understood that their experiences might be different, but the causes of their suffering were linked. White supremacy and patriarchy, right? That these are linked systems of power, suddenly start to see themselves as having sort of different movements. And the consequences of this are extreme. So I'm gonna, okay. What I'd like to say, though, more broadly, so I'm a cultural historian. I'm very interested in ideas. And I just wanted to say in general, so I've given you kind of like the nuts and bolts of legal changes that produced the suffrage movement that emerges. It waxes and wanes. It was like at its peak in the 1840s, 1850s. We see it kind of like fizzle out and die out in the late 19th century because there's such a divide in the movement over the issue of race and how women should seek the right to vote. And then you see it reemerging in the progressive era, which I'll discuss here in a minute. But what I want to say, why did women ask for the right to vote when they did? And I kind of already mentioned this, but if you can't read that, what we need to remember is modern capitalism increased women's dependence on men and decreased men's dependence on women. Does that make sense? With the rise of the wage labor class, men for the first time didn't need women as much as women needed men. Historically, men and women needed each other the same amount. You had to get married and you had to reproduce to live on a farm. And so in the 19th century is the first time women actually economically needed men in a way men didn't need women. So that what do you think was kind of like invented to kind of solve this problem? Well, prostitution skyrockets in the 19th century, but romantic love. Now, I know that was a huge overstatement. Don't quote me. I know romantic love wasn't invented in the 19th century, but I get that. But its association with marriage and its association with women does change in the 19th century dramatically. Romantic love did not used to be considered something women sought. It was something men sought, because you're not going to get dad's farm unless you have a wife, right? Women pushed off marriage as long as they could often in the 19th century. And the average age of marriage in the 19th century for women was like 23. And just weirdly, in the 1950s, it's 18. It's creepy, right? It's a different, isn't that wild, right? So, as this relationship as extended, my next point here is extended family kinship labor is replaced by liberal individualism, where the liberal individual is a person who has rights as opposed to the group. Suddenly, each individual person having a voice in politics is considered the human right, as opposed to the collective whole. And what I would argue as someone who supports socialism and redistributing the wealth and all these things, if you study history with any rigor, I'm going to make a generalization, but I'm doing it. In societies where women have more power and where women, there tends to be greater distributions of wealth and less celebration of private property. There does seem to be a connection between capitalism and women's degradation. I'm not saying it's the sole cause of it, but in societies where kinship, labor, and group solidarity are the sort of sole function of the economy, women tend to, I'll say it this way, you're not going to see so many feminist movements there. And we tend to think that's because they're like oppressed. But what if it's because they don't feel like they need feminism? Does that make sense? We're like, we're fine. We're fine. One of my favorite professors, he's my advisor actually, he's a woman's historian. I love that, introducing him. He's a white man. If you watch this video, he's a white man. And I always introduce him, he's a woman's historian, right? But he said there's a huge difference between being stuck in the home and running the home. And we need to think about these different kinds of societies in these ways, and having power over the home, over being confined to the domestic. Okay, so All right. Moving then ahead to the modern suffrage movement. Oops, I'll just go ahead and put this. So the modern suffrage movement, it emerges in the progressive era in the women get the right to vote in this country in 1920. The progressive era is right at the end of the 19th century, right up to World War I. We think of that as like the halting screech to progressivism. I'll speak a little bit more about progressivism in just a minute here. But one thing to consider as we think about the suffrage movement, just in interest of time, I couldn't give you a lot of the details about the movement. I wanted to just give you the broader ideologies tonight so we can think about maybe why we live in a world where, a lot of women voted for Trump. Like what happened? Sorry if you voted for Trump. I didn't, obviously. Okay. So in the modern suffrage movement, the one that sort of replaced the suffrage movement that was linked to a human freedom movement, if you will, the one that was linked to the abolitionist movement. So the modern suffrage movement that emerges 1890s, achieved success in 1820, it had major divisions within it. It actually had like different, associations. Like if you were a woman suffragist, you probably you would send your dues to one of two groups, and you would not let the other group know that you had gone to. And it's like the NAWSA or the NW, right? Like they just kept separating off from each other. Like, no, we don't agree with you. And what they were debating is not whether or not women should have the right to vote, but why women should have the right to vote. It was what's interesting is these are women engaging in what? The woman question. What are women good for? Why should women have the right to vote? What's a woman, right? And the essential divide between the movement is this one. Should women have the right to vote because they are women, they are different from men? Or should women have the right to vote because they are equal to men, because they are human beings? I know, I promise that I will keep to my word on time. Okay, we're good. I want to pause here, though, for a minute and ask you guys to jump in for a second. Raise your hand if you like the difference one the best. One person, okay. Raise your hand if you like the equality one the best. Okay, now let's tear this up, okay? When I first learned about, to be quite honest with you, the longer I study it, the less I know where I stand on it. And I always tell my students, if you know right away what you think about this problem, then I haven't taught it well. Because it's so complicated. Think about the problems that emerge when you live in a society where the citizen is defined as neutral, as just a non-sexed body. You live in a society where it takes till 2017 till the mayor mentions that tampons are a right for women prisoners. Imagine if men had to pay every time they had to wipe their ass. Can you imagine? If we didn't provide toilet paper, but that's a universal body. Tampons? No, you got to buy that yourself, lady. You know that we just now started providing menstrual pads and tampons to women prisoners? And right? Okay. So and another way to think about this, I know there are real problematics with comparing race and gender, but I think you can also learn by doing this. Think about the politics of black-only spaces, for example, or the difference between perhaps, I know that I'm generalizing here, but a Martin Luther King approach to inclusion versus a Malcolm X approach to somewhat separation and celebration of black culture, as opposed to joining white culture and saying, I don't want to be sitting at the lunch counters with the assholes who've been oppressing us, right? So a neutral citizen denies difference and often ends up basing civic inclusion around the white male body implicitly. And there's a real danger in assuming that we're all the same. Does that make sense? Someone stop me if I get the quote wrong. I forgot to write it down. But Audre Lorde said something along the lines of, it's not our differences that divide us, or it's not our differences that are a problem. And she doesn't then go on to say, I want to say what she doesn't say. She doesn't say, it's our inability to overcome them. What she says is, it's our inability to recognize that we are different. There's this ad campaign right now in the subways. There's I think it's a white woman and a black man, and it's what we have in common is more than we have different. And every time I look at it, I'm like, God, that kind of just pisses me off. On so many different race, gender issues, I'm just no, I've never been stopped and frisked. I have a really different experience of this city than a black man. You know what I'm saying? And it's our decision to say that we're the same that somehow ends up marginalizing the same groups of people over and over again. So I want to just say, the difference thing, don't deny it flat out. And also, if you study labor rights in this country, The progressive era was an era of like people fighting for workers' rights in the workplace. Nearly every piece of labor legislation that was passed in this country was passed by women's unions first, like 8-hour work days, child protection laws, et cetera. And the way they framed their fight was, but we're women. What are you going to do, make us work 15 hours a day? And the state's like, you know what, you're right. You're women. And then like eventually men's labor unions get the same rights. So to share, I want to share with you one of the most famous advocates of the different school of thought. So you can't read this. This is Jane Addams. And I'll just quickly read here. This is a very different school of thought. She says, unsanitary housing, poisonous sewage, contaminated water, infant mortality, the spread of contagion, adulterated food, impure milk, smoke-laden air, ill-ventilated factories, dangerous occupations, juvenile crime, unwholesome crowding, prostitution, and drunkenness are the enemies which the modern cities must face and overcome. Would they survive? Logically, their electorate should be those made up of those who can bear a valiant part in this arduous contest, those who in the past have had at least attempted to care for children, to clean house, to prepare food, to isolate the family from moral dangers, those who have traditionally taken care of that side of life, which inevitably becomes a subject of municipal consideration and control as soon as the population is congested. City housekeeping has failed partly because women, the traditional housekeepers, have not been consulted as to its multiform activities. Now, I'm going to be honest, like, do I like being told I get to vote because I'm keeping house? No, right? It really would have irked me, but as a historian, I feel that we have to pay due to what worked. What do you think worked? This form of protest or the equality-based protest led by someone like Alice Paul? This is what worked, yeah. No, absolutely. No, I'm glad they're asking the question. I'm glad that I'm making you struggle with this. I think any sort of feminist philosophy would say that every problem must be understood contextually. And in some places, the body must be considered, and in other places, a universal human subject can be the sort of sole basis for passing policy. Yeah, feminism, what's awesome about it is like, screw rational, universal abstractions. You can allow for context. You can allow for judging the situation in the situation, right? We can acknowledge that we're all human beings with different contexts. Okay, so, I am going to have to wrap up here in just a few minutes. So I just want to briefly mention then that chasm that was created with the passage of the 15th Amendment had dramatic, horrifying consequences. I'm going to have to wrap this up. But one of the saddest consequences of this is if you think about even the way I frame the historical chronology of women's suffrage, to say that women got the right to vote in 1920 is to completely erase the fact that a huge population of women did not get the right to vote until when? 1965, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, right? Until Congress actually protected people of color's access to the ballot, it's really erroneous of us to talk about universal women's suffrage. One thing that you find if you study 20th century suffrage movement, the darkest, ugliest side of the movement, is that some women, in particular, when I say Jim Crow suffrage, some women, not just Southern, but in particular Southern white women, advocated for their right to vote on the basis that they would help their white men keep Jim Crow in place. They said, you want to keep Jim Crow in place? You want to keep segregation happening? You want to keep our men controlling Congress? Make sure your white women can vote, and we'll help you keep black Southerners down. And it's a part of the movement. And so, why is this happening? I'm not going to take on that question. I will say, though, there is something about the way the 20th century and the rise of modern capitalism led to the sort of celebration of the bourgeoisie individual, and that the sort of merit-based discussion, like even within progressivism, progressives believed everybody should have the right to vote, but then you can't have a bunch of dumb people voting, so then they tried to encourage public education. They raised property taxes so that we would have more schools, which sounds great, doesn't it? Education, I'm a teacher, right? Do you really think you have to be formally educated to be politically smart? No, you don't. This idea that uneducated people are dumb is so classist and so biased. And so the progressive era, the era in which women get the right to vote, we have to acknowledge it was an era that celebrated a certain kind of uplifting of people, which meant a celebration of a particular form of the human subject, right? The educated, middle class, bourgeois individual, heterosexual, married, procreative, will eventually live in a suburb, eventually buy a lot of throw pillows. You get the picture, right? Like, this is a citizen who matters, right? Not the citizen who perhaps lives communally on a farm with extended kinship. Or, I mean, one of the things, I'm rambling here a bit, but I just have to say this. At the end of the Civil War, with the 40 acres and a mule thing, it did happen. And when black families were given land by Sherman, I'm not sure what my mind is doing here, but I'm going there. When they were asked what they wanted to do with the land, all these black families said, we just don't want to go crash crops. We want to grow for ourselves. And they understood, after providing for capitalism for so long, they understood to push for it wasn't just for themselves, but if we're going to advocate for human freedom, we have to divorce ourselves of global capitalism. They understood this intuitively. And the women's suffrage movement, by and large, lost that sense of knowledge that they had in the 19th century and that connection to going after the source of their oppression as opposed to their individual access to power. So, as I wrap up here, I was going to show you guys some, as much as I just made, criticize them, I do have to mention, these are women that also engaged in demonstrating in front of Wilson during World War I, were imprisoned, went on hunger strikes, were force-fed. Some of them, not necessarily here, but in England, women died from being force-fed in their hunger strikes. So hunger strikes is a way to create political awareness of your cause. Do you think they brought in like the best trained doctors to force-feed these women who are on strike? So they would like pump their lungs filled with oatmeal or burst their stomachs by overfeeding them after weeks of self-starvation. I just say this because if you ever think you don't have time to vote, you have time to vote, right? There's a night of terror where Alice Paul and her other suffrage activists, the police, they arrested them when they were protesting in front of the White House here, and they chained them to the ceilings of prisons and beat them, put them in solitary confinement. So this is it's just like a harsh battle for the right to vote. I am pressed for time here, so I was going to show you guys. Do we have 4 minutes? Do we? Okay. Well, it's not embedded? Is this embedded? Okay. No, it's not embedded. That's okay. I was going to show you guys, if you're interested, we are actually pressed for time, so I won't show the clip, but I'll go back if you want to write it down. This movie is super flawed, but if you're interested in Yeah, we'll send it out. We'll send you out this clip. It shows Alice Paul, who was the leader of the modern movement. Raise your hand if you've never even heard her name, right? Yeah, I mean, the other like famous suffragists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, these women did not live to see the vote. Alice Paul carried on this tradition, and nobody even knows who she is. She was subjected to this torture, and there's a movie made about her life recently. It's a bad movie. They try to make it hip, and it's just. But there is an incredible scene where they recreate what happens to the prisoners. And she very much invokes this language of equality. So she's kind of the antithesis to Jane Addams, where she says, he's like, tell me about your cause. Why do you want the right to vote? To this doctor who's studying her while she's in prison. And she's like, that is the strangest question. Why do you want the right to vote? Right? And then they show her being force-fed. And you really understand very quickly, force-feeding has nothing to do with keeping something alive. It has everything to do with breaking the movement. It did, though, backfire on Wilson. Eventually, Alice Paul was able to get out to the press what was happening to them in prison through a sympathetic prison guard, the torture that they were enduring. And while Wilson was busy making the world safe for democracy in World War I, it was released in the press that he was torturing women in prison who were asking for democracy at home. And he kind of started to look like a big asshole. He's a horrible, horrible man. But the torture of the women in prison actually did go far to help them kind of raise awareness for how bloody the fight had become. A lot of folks don't also know, just in terms of promoting social change, it happens state by state. If you want to change the world, get involved in local politics. Each state started to pass suffrage laws first. It didn't happen all at once with the federal passage of the law, but women did get the right to achieve, technically the right to vote in 1920, thanks to this movement. But I'll wrap up, just coming back then to the woman question. This is somewhat just a shout out to my heroine of all time. It's not Buffy, it's someone else. But so thinking back to our question I asked you guys, what are women? What is the woman? What are women good for? I think the person who asked the question most eloquently is Simone de Beauvoir. And so I'll show you, if you're not familiar with her, she's considered kind of the mother of modern feminist thought. Feminist thought, I'll say. But read this quote and remember that she wrote it in 1949, okay? Enough ink has been spilled in the quarreling over feminism, now practically over, and perhaps we should say no more about it. It is still talked about, however, for the voluminous nonsense uttered during the last century seems to have done little to illuminate the problem. After all, is there a problem? And if so, what is it? Are there women? Really? I'm just going to leave it there, but I'll let you know. Her answer is, not really. Okay, thanks everybody.